de-industrialization. There's this meme going around how India, at its peak, produced a quarter of the world's textiles, but then this proportion shrunk to around 4% of world production, and a similar story occurred with India's percentage of the world economy generally. The exact numbers vary depending on who's saying this, but this is the general narrative. And of course it's true. India made up a smaller proportion of the world economy, but it's not because their economy shrank, but because Europe and Europe-like countries such as Japan grew during the Industrial Revolution, which is known as the Great Divergence. And I listened to speeches and talks by this guy Shashi Tharoor, and one thing he mentioned was that the British destroyed the Indian textile industry.
In Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. In fact, Britain's Industrial Revolution was actually premised upon the de-industrialization of India. The handloom weavers, for example, famed across the world, whose products were exported around the world, Britain came right in. There were actually these weavers making fine muslin, light as woven air, it was said. And Britain came right in, smashed their thumbs, broke their looms, imposed tariffs and duties on their cloth and products, and started, of course, taking the raw materials from India and shipping back manufactured cloth, flooding the world's markets with what became the products of the dark and satanic mills of Victorian England. That meant that the weavers in India became beggars, and India went from being a world-famous exporter of finished cloth into an importer, went from having 27% of world trade to less than 2%.
Now, my first thought was that they probably just outcompeted India since it was machines versus hand spinning. But then I thought, you know what? Why don't I just check if this is actually true? Imagine if this basic statement of fact that the Indian textile industry declined when the English took over, if this was just matter-of-factly false. And of course, it is. The English were very good record keepers and kept track of how much clothing was produced in India, how much they were exporting, to where, how much they were importing, etc. And what Michael Twomey reported sourcing the Indian Statistical Abstract was that from 1880 to 1929, the domestic production within India of machine-spun cloth increased over 9-fold, and hand-spun cloth actually increased around 3.5-fold. Broadbury, Custodis, and Gupta do an analysis that goes even further back, and they conclude that textile production was increasing, though not at this pace, as far back as 1750 up to 1871, which is when Twomey's analysis began. And what is true is that exports of Indian textiles went down, and imports of textiles from Britain were also increasing during this period. And all these clothes were going to the Indian population, and the price of clothes in India collapsed. By 1871, the cost of any given item of clothing was less than half of what it was in 1750. Actually, having checked my sources again, it looks like Indian textile exports actually increased after a decline from the 1790 number, matching that export volume by 1880. So even if we're just talking about exports, no, the Raj ultimately presided over an increase in Indian textile exports after an initial decline. So even that line that Indian export volume declined is misleading and more false than true. Not that it even matters given how much textile production increased in India and how almost all of that increase was going to the Indian population. And another addendum, where did Britain get its cotton from? Well, from 1806 to 1880, about 65.9% of Britain's cotton came from the United States, according to Stanley Chapman from the University of Nottingham. So I guess Britain industrialized on the back of the United States and prevented the United States from industrializing because buying cotton from someone prevents them from building factories, and that's why the United States never managed to industrialize. Oh wait, Thoreau's retarded. And if you look further back, Brazil makes up roughly 64.5% of all British cotton imports from 1786 to 1809, and almost nothing is coming from Asia. From Frank Hitchcock's work, Agricultural Imports to the United Kingdom 1896 to 1900, it's stated that 74% of the UK's cotton came from the United States over these years, 22% came from Egypt, and a whopping 1.7% came from India. 1.6% came from Brazil, and China, Peru, and Chile, and some combination apparently made up most of the rest, although where the rest comes from he doesn't quite say. But unless someone can find some compelling data to the contrary, it appears that Britain got almost none of their cotton from India, that most of their cotton that went into British textile mills came from Brazil, the United States, and Egypt. And of those three, only Egypt ended up being really poor. So this seems to go against the idea that buying cotton from someone prevents them from industrializing, but it's irrelevant since the UK bought so little of their cotton from India anyway. When the Impressionists, as I call them, claim that India was de-industrialized, they're mainly talking about textiles. And it's shocking, they're literally just wrong. This isn't even a debate point, they're just balls in your face wrong. That talking point is literally just a lie, and this is something that's somewhat difficult to convey to a normal person, because a lot of people have a hard time believing that a guy like Thoreau, who's promoted by so many institutions, given so many awards, and has all these credentials and all these funny hats and all these people promoting him, and is, for example, speaking at the Oxford Debating Society, would be wrong about such a simple, verifiable, and central point. But here it is. And I think one problem is that this is a founding myth for India. In fact, it's on their flag that the British prevented Indians from producing textiles. So how do you tell them that not only is this not true, but it's 180 degrees in the opposite direction, that the British rule led to a roughly tenfold increase in textile production within India, and that Gandhi was either a liar or kind of stupid? But then what are we doing here? Are we just doing make-believe? Do you want the British to be the bad guy? Do you have some psychological need for that? It would almost be easier if Thoreau's error was more sophisticated, something that a smart person would make, because I could point out the nuance of that error and it would be more believable that intelligent researchers could make this kind of high IQ error. But no, it's simple, and people like Thoreau should be embarrassed, as should anyone who parroted this talking point without bothering to check out. Being a real person trying to actually understand the world, you need statistics. Yes, people can lie with statistics, but it's a lot harder to do so, and it's almost never an outright lie, but a misleading perspective. For example, saying that India's share of the global textile industry went from 24% to 4%, or whatever the specific numbers is, that's not a lie. But it's misleading because it leads you to believe that the textile industry shrank when in actuality it grew at an unprecedented rate to become many times larger than it was previously. It just wasn't expanding as fast as it was in the European countries and Japan. Thoreau says he has any number of examples proving whatever he wants to believe, and I totally believe him. Thoreau, I believe you. I believe you have little anecdotes and conversation fillers to go on until the end of fucking time, which dummies will interpret you as having some deep and rich knowledge, when really you don't know the basic facts about your country's own history. Right? You don't know that textile manufacturing went up under the Raj. And worse yet, you do, or you're just lying. I don't know which is worse. And so he gets on here and it's like, oh, he's talking about cricket and tea. Oh, he's so charming. And all the retards in the audience clap like seals as not a single chart or data table was presented that day.
Donkey Desi American Professor. Jai Hind, and God bless America.